The alarm did not wake me gently. It tore through the sleeping quarters of the outpost like a blade through paper, red lights spinning across the walls before my eyes were even open. I was on my feet before I understood why, my hand already reaching for my uniform jacket, my heart slamming against my ribs. My name is Daniel Cole. 6 months ago, I was a junior liaison officer assigned to the Concord Station Meridian, a massive orbital platform built by a coalition of alien nations to keep peace among the stars. 6 months ago, humanity was the newest member of that coalition, and the smallest voice in every room we entered. That night, the smallest voice in the room was about to become the loudest sound in the galaxy. I ran down the corridor, boots echoing on metal, passing crew members from 3 other species who moved with far less urgency than I did. A tall Calvoran diplomat named Elith Corvain stood frozen near a viewport, her long limbs trembling slightly, her 4 eyes fixed on something outside. I slowed only long enough to follow her gaze. Through the viewport, far below us, a colony world burned. New Harbor, my colony, human families, human children, human streets, all of it wrapped in fire that even from orbit looked far too bright, far too fast, far too wrong. I did not stop to process it. I could not afford to. I pushed past Ilith and reached the command deck, where Admiral Laura Bennett stood at the center of a storm of shouting voices and flashing screens. She was the highest-ranking human officer on the station, a woman who had spent 30 years earning quiet respect in a career that rarely gave humans any respect at all. Tonight, she was not quiet. "Talk to me," she said, and the room fell into something close to silence. A young communications officer named Grace Miller answered first, her voice tight and controlled despite the fear behind her eyes. "Unprovoked strike, Admiral. Skarn Dominion warships dropped out of hyperspace 20 minutes ago. No warning beacon, no declaration. They hit New Harbor's orbital defense grid first, then went straight for the surface. Casualties." Grace hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know before she spoke again. "Unknown. Communications with the surface are down. We have colonists trapped in 3 major shelters, and Skarn landing craft are already inside the atmosphere." I felt something cold settle into my stomach, because I knew someone on that planet. My younger brother, Ethan Cole, had transferred to the New Harbor garrison only 2 months earlier. He wrote to me every week. His last message had arrived just yesterday, full of jokes about the local food and complaints about the heat. I did not say his name out loud. There was no time for that kind of weakness, not yet. Admiral Bennett turned to the wide display at the center of the room, where a holographic image of the Concord Council chamber flickered to life. Representatives from a dozen species appeared, their faces ranging from concern to careful, practiced neutrality. At the head of the display sat the rotating chair of the council, currently held by a Velkari elder named Sorinth, whose slow, measured voice had never once, in my experience, matched the speed of an actual crisis. "Admiral Bennett," Sorinth said, his tone calm in a way that made my jaw tighten. "We understand the situation on New Harbor is distressing. The Council will convene an emergency session to discuss appropriate response measures." "Discuss," Bennett repeated flatly. "Protocol requires deliberation before any military action is authorized," Sorinth continued. "We must avoid escalating a regional conflict into something larger. I propose we open the floor to statements from each delegation, beginning with, 'My people are dying right now,'" Bennett said, cutting him off with a sharpness that made even the alien delegates lean back slightly. "Every minute you spend opening the floor is a minute someone on that planet does not get to live through." Sorinth's expression did not change. That was the thing about the older species in the Concord. They had seen empires rise and fall over centuries, and to them, urgency itself seemed like a kind of impatience, almost an embarrassment. They measured wisdom in the length of a pause before speaking. Humans had never measured anything that way. We never had the luxury of slow centuries. Our entire history was written in decades of struggle, compressed and desperate, every generation fighting to give the next one more time than they themselves had been given. We did not know how to wait when someone was dying. We had never learned that skill, and looking around that council chamber, I understood for the first time that this was not a weakness. It was the exact opposite. While the council debates, Bennett said, turning away from the display entirely, my people will not simply wait to see what is left of New Harbor when the discussion concludes. A ripple of surprise moved through the holographic chamber. Sorenth opened his mouth to respond, but Bennett had already turned to her staff, and in that moment I watched something remarkable happen. I watched the entire command deck shift from confusion into motion, as if the Admiral's words had flipped a switch buried deep in every human on that station. Officers who had been standing frozen only seconds earlier were suddenly moving with total purpose. Grace Miller was already routing emergency channels to Fleet Command back on Earth. A logistics officer named Owen Hart was pulling up deployment schedules for 3 different response fleets stationed within striking distance of New Harbor. Someone else was already calculating burn times and jump coordinates before anyone had given a formal order. I stood there for a moment, watching it unfold, and I understood something about my own people that I had never fully understood before. We had spent our entire short history in the Concorde, being treated as reckless children, too disorganized to be trusted, too quick to anger, too unpredictable to plan alongside. The other species saw our arguments, our elections, our messy public disagreements, and they assumed chaos. They assumed weakness. They had never seen what happened when that chaos found a single, unified purpose. "Lieutenant Cole," Bennett said, and I snapped to attention, surprised she even knew my name. "I need someone on the ground intelligence team who understands the New Harbor colony layout. You lived there for 2 years before this posting. Get to the shuttle bay." "Yes, Admiral," I said, and my legs were already moving before my mind had fully caught up. As I ran, I passed Eilith Corvain again, still standing near the viewport, though now she had turned to watch the humans around her with an expression I did not have time to interpret. I would think about that expression later. In that moment, all I could think about was Ethan, somewhere down on that burning planet, and the fact that for the first time since I had joined the Concorde, I finally understood what people meant when they said humanity did not wait for permission to protect its own. The shuttle bay was chaos in the best possible sense. A controlled storm of engineers and pilots and Marines moving with a kind of synchronized urgency I had never witnessed among any other species. Ships that were not scheduled to launch for another 18 hours were already being fueled. Marines who had been off duty 20 minutes earlier were suiting up in full combat gear, their faces set with the particular grim focus of people who understood exactly what they were about to walk into. I found Captain Nathan Price near the boarding ramp of a transport vessel, studying a datapad with the same intensity most people reserved for defusing a bomb. He looked up as I approached, and something in his eyes told me he already knew what I was about to ask. "Your brother's stationed at New Harbor," he said before I could speak. It was not a question. "Garrison Unit 3, I answered. "Perimeter defense." Price nodded once, a small human gesture that somehow carried the full weight of everything he was not saying out loud. "We launch in 11 minutes. You're with the intelligence team on the lead ship. We'll know more once we're closer. But Cole, I need you steady. Not just for the mission, for yourself." I appreciated that he said it plainly, instead of dressing it up in comfort. There was no time for comfort tonight. As I boarded the ship, I glanced back one final time at the viewport, at the burning planet still visible in the distance, and at the alien delegates still frozen in their slow, careful deliberation on the display behind me. Somewhere in that council chamber, Sorenth was likely still speaking about protocol and de-escalation, still measuring his words with the patience of a species that had never needed to move quickly to survive. Humanity was already moving. We had not started this war. The Skarn Dominion had made that choice for us, striking without warning against a colony full of people who had done nothing but exist within reach of an empire that assumed no one would dare respond quickly enough to matter. They had made a terrible miscalculation. As the shuttle doors sealed and the engines roared to life beneath me, I thought about every alien officer who had ever smiled politely at our fleet numbers, every diplomat who had ever called our species impulsive as though it were an insult rather than a warning. I thought about Ethan, somewhere below in the smoke and fire, trusting that the people above him would not simply sit and discuss his fate over the course of days. We were not going to discuss anything. We were going to finish what the Skarn Dominion had started, and we were going to do it before the Council even finished taking attendance. The engines reached full power, and the shuttle lifted off the deck, and I closed my eyes for just one moment, steadying my breathing the way I had been trained to, and when I opened them again, I was no longer a nervous liaison officer worried about protocol. I was ready for war. The descent through New Harbor's atmosphere felt like falling through the inside of a furnace. Outside the shuttle's reinforced viewport, the sky itself seemed to be burning, streaked with the orange trails of falling debris and the harsh white flashes of distant explosions. I gripped the edge of my seat and forced my breathing to stay even, the way Captain Price had instructed everyone during the short briefing before launch. "Panic gets people killed," he had said, standing at the front of the crowded transport bay, his voice carrying easily over the hum of the engines. "Focus keeps them alive. I need everyone thinking clearly the moment we land, not a second later." Beside me sat Grace Miller, who had been reassigned from communications to the ground intelligence team once Admiral Bennett realized how badly they needed someone who could process incoming data as fast as it arrived. She had a data pad balanced on her knee, fingers moving quickly across its surface as she cross-referenced satellite imagery with old colony blueprints. Garrison Unit 3's last confirmed position was near the Eastern Shelter Complex, she said, without looking up, clearly having anticipated my question before I asked it. "That's the same shelter housing roughly 400 civilians. If your brother's unit held that position, he's probably still fighting to protect it." I nodded, unable to trust my voice for a moment. 400 civilians and one very stubborn younger brother who had always insisted on doing the hardest job in any room he walked into. The shuttle shuddered violently as something exploded nearby, and the pilot's voice crackled over the comm system, tight with controlled urgency. "Multiple Skarn fighters inbound, changing our approach vector. Everyone brace." I grabbed the safety harness and held on as the ship banked hard, the artificial gravity struggling to compensate for the sudden maneuver. Through the viewport I caught a glimpse of the battle unfolding in the sky above New Harbor, human interceptors weaving between heavier Skarn warships in patterns that looked almost too fast, too aggressive to be survivable. And yet they were surviving. More than that, they were winning ground, picking apart the Skarn formation with a coordination that seemed to catch the enemy pilots off guard again and again. I later learned that human fleet doctrine, developed over centuries of brutal, chaotic warfare on our own world, emphasized speed and adaptability above almost everything else. While Skarn pilots followed rigid, predictable engagement patterns drilled into them through generations of ritualized conflict, human pilots adjusted their tactics mid-battle, reading the enemy's movements and countering them within seconds rather than following a fixed plan. It was working. Even in that brief, chaotic glimpse through the viewport, I could see it working. The shuttle finally leveled out and began its final descent toward a makeshift landing zone near the Eastern Shelter Complex, a stretch of open ground that had clearly been cleared under fire, judging by the scorch marks and wreckage scattered across its perimeter. The moment the doors opened, the sound hit me first, a deafening wall of distant explosions, weapons fire, and shouted orders in a dozen overlapping voices. Captain Price was already moving, and the rest of us followed close behind, boots hitting scorched ground as we sprinted toward the defensive line surrounding the shelter. Marines in full combat gear moved with practiced efficiency around us, some carrying wounded colonists toward safety, others holding the perimeter against Skarn ground forces advancing from the tree line beyond. I spotted a familiar face among the defenders almost immediately, a young medic named Olivia Barnes who had trained alongside Ethan back at the academy years earlier. She recognized me too, her expression shifting briefly with surprise before settling back into focused determination. "Cole," she called out, pulling bandages tight around a wounded soldier's arm without missing a motion. "Your brother's team is holding the north checkpoint. Last I heard, he was still standing." Relief hit me like a physical force, but I did not let myself linger on it. There was no time. Captain Price was already directing the intelligence team toward a command tent set up near the center of the defensive perimeter, where a holographic map displayed the shifting positions of both human and Skarn forces across the shelter's surrounding terrain. Inside the tent, a weathered colonel named Derek Hale looked up as we entered, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes sharp and alert. "Good. Reinforcements. We need eyes on Skarn troop movements to the east. They're trying to flank the shelter through the old mining tunnels." Grace was already pulling up satellite data, cross-referencing it with the tunnel schematics from the colony's original construction plans. The tunnels connect to 3 separate exit points near the shelter's perimeter. If they're moving through there, they could bypass our main defensive line entirely. Colonel Hale nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of. We don't have enough units to cover all 3 exits and hold the main line at the same time." I studied the holographic map for a moment, something clicking into place in my mind as I remembered details from my 2 years living in New Harbor before my transfer to the Concord station. "There's a 4th exit," I said, drawing everyone's attention. "An old maintenance shaft near the water reclamation facility. It's not on the official blueprints because it was sealed off years ago during a construction dispute, but the seal was never permanent. If the Skarn forces know the tunnel system well enough to plan a flanking maneuver, there's a chance they know about that shaft too." Colonel Hale's jaw tightened. "That's a hole in our entire defensive plan." "Then let's close it," Captain Price said, already studying the map with a calculating expression. "Cole, you know the layout better than anyone here. Lead a small team to secure that shaft before the Skarn forces find it." I felt a flicker of nerves, quickly pushed aside by the weight of the responsibility being placed on me. "Yes, sir." Within minutes, I found myself moving through the chaos of the defensive perimeter alongside a small squad of Marines, weapons ready, senses sharp. The path to the water reclamation facility wound through the outer edge of the colony, past buildings scarred with battle damage, past the wreckage of vehicles that had clearly been caught in the initial Skarn assault. As we moved, I could not stop thinking about Ethan, holding the north checkpoint somewhere on the other side of the shelter perimeter. I forced myself to focus on the mission in front of me instead, trusting that Olivia's earlier words meant he was still fighting, still alive, still holding his position the same way he had always held every position he was given. We reached the maintenance shaft just as the first sounds of movement echoed from somewhere below, distant footsteps and the low mechanical hum of Skarn equipment. My heart pounded as I signaled the squad to take defensive positions around the entrance. "They found it," whispered a young Marine beside me, her voice tense. "Then we make sure they regret it," replied the squad's sergeant, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Webb, checking his weapon with calm efficiency. The confrontation that followed happened faster than I expected, a brief, intense exchange near the shaft entrance as Skarn soldiers emerged into the open, clearly expecting to bypass the human defenses unnoticed. The Marines around me moved with the same precise coordination I had witnessed among the pilots earlier, communicating through short, clipped signals, adjusting their positions fluidly as the situation evolved. Within minutes, the threat at the shaft entrance had been neutralized. The flanking maneuver stopped before it could reach the shelter. I stood there afterward, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through me, and I understood something new about the nature of the fight unfolding across New Harbor. The Skarn Dominion had planned this assault expecting a slow, disorganized human response, the kind of hesitation and confusion they likely associated with a young, undisciplined species still finding its footing among the stars. What they had encountered instead was an adaptive, coordinated defense capable of identifying and closing gaps in real time, adjusting to threats faster than their rigid battle plans could account for. Sergeant Webb clapped a hand on my shoulder as we regrouped. "Good call on that shaft, Lieutenant. You probably just saved a few hundred lives." I nodded, unable to fully process the weight of that statement in the moment. My mind was already moving toward the next objective, the next piece of the larger battle still unfolding across the colony. As we made our way back toward the command tent to report the shaft secured, a young Marine's comm device crackled to life with an update from the North Checkpoint. I stopped walking the instant I heard the words. North Checkpoint holding, but taking heavy pressure. Requesting immediate reinforcement. Ethan's checkpoint. I did not wait for permission. I turned to Sergeant Webb, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. I need to get to the North Checkpoint. Webb studied me for a moment, then nodded, understanding passing between us without needing further explanation. Then let's move. As we made our way through the chaos of the battle still raging around New Harbor, I thought about everything that had happened since that alarm first tore through my sleep only hours earlier. I thought about Admiral Bennett refusing to wait for a council still debating protocol, about the pilots adapting their tactics in real time against a rigid enemy, about the Marines who had closed a gap in the defense before the enemy could exploit it. The Skarn Dominion had expected a slow, chaotic response from a species they viewed as reckless and unprepared. Instead, they had triggered something far more dangerous, a species that did not need permission or lengthy deliberation to act, a species capable of turning individual chaos into unified, devastating purpose the moment enough was at stake. As we approached the North Checkpoint, the sounds of battle grew louder, sharper, more immediate. I gripped my weapon tighter, my thoughts narrowing to a single, urgent focus. Somewhere ahead, my brother was still fighting, and I intended to reach him before this night ended, whatever it took. The war the Skarn Dominion had started was only just beginning to show them exactly what kind of species they had chosen to provoke. The North Checkpoint came into view through a haze of smoke, a cluster of reinforced barricades set up along the narrow road leading into the shelter complex. Even from a distance, I could see the intensity of the fighting, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness, the shapes of Skarn soldiers advancing in disciplined waves against a thinning line of human defenders. My chest tightened as I searched the chaos for any sign of Ethan, my mind refusing to consider the possibility that I might already be too late. Sergeant Webb moved beside me, directing our small squad toward a defensible position that would let us reinforce the checkpoint without simply running into open fire. "There," Webb said, pointing toward a cluster of soldiers holding a forward position near the main barricade. "That's their command point. If your brother's leading a squad here, that's probably where we'll find him." We moved quickly, using the wreckage of a burned-out transport vehicle for cover as we approached. The closer we got, the more clearly I could make out details of the fighting, the disciplined formations of Skarn soldiers pressing forward, the human defenders holding their ground with a stubbornness that seemed to genuinely frustrate the attacking force. I finally spotted him through the smoke, and relief crashed through me with such force that I nearly stumbled. Ethan stood behind an overturned supply crate, directing a small group of soldiers with sharp, confident hand signals, his uniform scorched and torn, but his movements steady and controlled. He looked older somehow, the easy humor I remembered from his letters replaced by a hardened focus I had never seen in him before. "Ethan," I called out as we closed the distance, and his head snapped toward the sound of my voice, disbelief flashing across his face for just a moment before he recovered his composure. "Daniel, what are you doing down here?" "Reinforcements," I said, dropping into cover beside him as weapons fire cracked overhead. We closed a flanking route through the old mining tunnels. Colonel Hale sent us to reinforce the checkpoint. Ethan managed a tired half-smile despite the chaos around us. "Trust you to show up in the middle of the worst night of my life and act like it's just another Tuesday. Someone has to keep you out of trouble," I replied, and for just a moment, despite everything happening around us, it felt almost like we were kids again, trading jokes to cover the fear neither of us wanted to admit to feeling. The moment did not last long. A fresh wave of Skarn soldiers surged forward along the road, and Ethan's expression hardened instantly back into focused determination. "They've been probing our line for the last hour, testing different angles of attack. I think they're trying to figure out our weak points before committing to a full assault. Sergeant Webb crouched beside us, studying the enemy formation through a pair of field binoculars. Their tactics are rigid, same formation, same spacing, same approach angle every time. If we can predict their next probe, we can set up a counter that actually hurts them instead of just holding the line. I thought back to what I had witnessed during the earlier confrontation at the maintenance shaft, the way the Marines had adapted instantly to the unexpected. The Skarn Dominion's rigid battle doctrine, so effective against opponents who followed similarly structured tactics, was proving to be a serious weakness against a species willing to break from convention entirely. "What if we don't hold the line?" I said slowly, an idea forming as I studied the terrain around the checkpoint. "What if we let them think they're finally breaking through, and then hit them from an angle they haven't accounted for?" Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued despite the danger of the situation. "Go on." I pointed toward a ridge of rocky terrain running parallel to the road, just beyond the reach of the Skarn formation's current line of sight. "If we pull back slightly here, right at the barricade, they'll read it as our position weakening. Their formation will push forward to exploit the gap, following the same rigid pattern they've used all night. But if we already have a team positioned along that ridge, we can hit their flank the moment they commit to the advance." Sergeant Webb studied the terrain for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's risky. If they don't take the bait, or if they adjust their tactics at the last moment, we'll have split our forces for nothing." "They haven't adjusted once tonight," Ethan said, his confidence growing as he considered the plan. "Every probe, every advance, it's all been the same pattern. I don't think adapting is something they're built to do quickly." Colonel Hale's voice crackled over the comm system moments later, having listened in on our exchange from the command tent. "Approved. Cole Jr., take a team up that ridge. Webb, hold the barricade and make it look convincing. I want this finished before they can call in reinforcements of their own." The plan moved quickly after that, adrenaline and urgency driving every decision. Ethan gathered a small team from his squad, and together we made our way carefully along the edge of the battlefield toward the ridge, staying low, using every available scrap of cover to avoid detection. Below us, Sergeant Webb's team began a controlled, gradual retreat from the barricade, careful to make the movement look like genuine weakness rather than a deliberate trap. It worked exactly as Ethan had predicted. The Skarn formation surged forward almost immediately, pressing toward the apparent gap in the human defensive line, with the same rigid, disciplined advance they had used throughout the entire engagement. From our position along the ridge, I watched their formation stretch and commit fully to the assault, completely unaware of the flanking force positioned above them. "Now," Ethan said quietly, and the team opened fire in a coordinated volley that caught the Skarn formation completely off guard. The effect was immediate and decisive. The rigid discipline that had served the Skarn soldiers so well against predictable opponents became a liability the moment their formation was struck from an unexpected angle. Confusion rippled through their ranks as officers tried to reorganize a strategy that had never accounted for this kind of adaptive counterattack. Sergeant Webb's team, seeing the flanking maneuver succeed, pressed forward from the barricade, catching the disoriented Skarn formation in a coordinated pincer that ended the engagement far faster than the grinding standoff that had defined the previous hour. Within minutes, the immediate threat to the checkpoint had been neutralized. I stood on the ridge afterward, breathing hard, watching the remaining Skarn forces retreat in a disorganized scramble that bore no resemblance to the disciplined advance they had maintained only minutes earlier. Ethan approached, clapping a hand on my shoulder with a tired but genuine grin. "Not bad for a desk officer." "I had good teachers," I replied, and for a moment we simply stood there together, letting the adrenaline slowly drain from our systems. The relief was short-lived. Colonel Hale's voice crackled over the comm system again, this time carrying a new urgency that immediately erased any sense of victory. "All units, be advised. Long-range sensors have detected a second Skarn fleet entering the system. This is not a raiding force. Analysis suggests full invasion strength." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Everything that had happened so far, the burning colony, the desperate defense of the shelters, the tense standoff at the checkpoint, had all been the opening move of a much larger conflict, one the Skarn Dominion had clearly planned as a decisive strike against a species they still believed to be weak and unprepared. Ethan's expression sobered instantly. A full invasion fleet. They're not just trying to hit one colony, they're trying to break us before we can properly respond. I thought back to the council chamber, to Admiral Bennett cutting off Sorenth's careful deliberation, to the fleets already moving before the vote had even concluded. The Skarn Dominion had launched their attack, believing humanity would still be tangled in the same slow, cautious processes as the rest of the Concord, unable to mount a serious response before their invasion force could secure a decisive advantage. They had badly underestimated exactly how fast humanity could move once it decided a threat was worth ending completely. Within the hour, updated reports began flooding into the command tent from orbit, painting a clearer picture of the scale of what was unfolding. The Skarn invasion fleet was not simply reinforcing their initial strike. They were bringing enough firepower to attempt a full-scale conquest of New Harbor and potentially several neighboring colonies, a bold and aggressive escalation clearly designed to overwhelm before any meaningful counter could be organized. What they had not accounted for was the speed at which human military command could restructure an entire response strategy. By the time their invasion fleet dropped fully into the system, Fleet Command back on Earth had already authorized the deployment of 3 additional battle groups, drawing on reserves that had been quietly maintained specifically for scenarios exactly like this one. Captain Price gathered the intelligence team back at the command tent as the full scope of the coming battle became clear. The Skarn Dominion is committing a significant portion of their regional military strength to this invasion. Fleet Command believes this is more than an isolated act of aggression. This is an attempt to test humanity's true military capability, likely based on outdated intelligence that severely underestimates what we've built over the past decade. Grace Miller pulled up a holographic display showing the approaching enemy formation, cross-referenced against known Skarn fleet compositions from Concord intelligence archives. Their fleet doctrine relies heavily on overwhelming numbers and rigid formation discipline. It's worked well for them against other species who fight similarly structured, methodical engagements. But it won't work against us, Colonel Hale finished, a grim satisfaction in his voice. I found myself standing beside Ethan as the briefing continued, both of us listening to the unfolding strategy with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Somewhere above us, the largest human military response in our short history among the stars was assembling with a speed that would have seemed impossible to the rest of the Concord only hours earlier. They picked the wrong colony to attack, Ethan murmured, watching the holographic display shift as new fleet positions updated in real time. They picked the wrong species, I corrected quietly, and beside me, I saw him nod in solemn agreement. Outside the command tent, the sky above New Harbor was beginning to shift, the chaotic scattered engagements of the initial assault giving way to the slow, deliberate assembly of a far larger confrontation. Human warships were arriving in greater numbers with every passing minute, forming defensive formations around the colony with a coordinated precision that stood in stark contrast to the rigid, predictable patterns of the approaching Skarn invasion fleet. The Skarn Dominion had come to New Harbor expecting an easy, decisive victory against a young, disorganized species still finding its place among the stars. Instead, they were about to discover exactly what happened when humanity decided that a war, once started against us, needed to be finished completely. As the final preparations for the coming battle unfolded around me, I thought about everything I had witnessed since that alarm first tore through my sleep. The Admiral, who refused to wait for permission. The pilots who adapted faster than any rigid enemy formation could account for. My own brother, standing firm at a checkpoint against overwhelming odds, unwilling to give an inch of ground even when the situation seemed hopeless. Humanity had never started this war. But as the massive Skarn invasion fleet continued its slow, deliberate approach toward New Harbor, unaware of the full scale of the response already assembling to meet them, I understood with complete certainty that we were about to show them exactly how a war like this would end. The battle for New Harbor lasted 3 days, though it felt to me like it stretched across weeks. I spent most of that time in the command tent, tracking fleet movements, relaying intelligence between orbit and ground forces, and watching numbers shift on a holographic display that represented far more than statistics. Every mark on that map was a person, a ship, a life balanced against the outcome of a war none of us had chosen to begin. By the time the Skarn invasion fleet finally retreated from the system, their losses were staggering. Human fleet doctrine, built on adaptability and rapid coordination, had systematically dismantled their rigid formations again and again, exploiting the same predictable patterns that had made them so effective against other, more cautious species in the Concord. Ground forces, reinforced by the same 3 battle groups Fleet Command had authorized within hours of the initial attack, pushed the remaining Skarn troops off New Harbor entirely, securing every shelter and reclaiming every inch of ground the enemy had taken during their initial assault. Victory should have felt triumphant. Instead, standing in the aftermath, surrounded by the wreckage of burned buildings and the quiet, exhausted faces of soldiers who had fought for 3 days straight, all I felt was a heavy, complicated grief. I found Ethan sitting alone near the ruins of what had once been the colony's central market, his uniform stained and torn, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. I sat down beside him without speaking, giving him the same silence I would have wanted if our positions had been reversed. "We lost people," he finally said, his voice quiet and rough. "Good people. People I trained with, people I ate meals with, just last week." "I know," I said, because there was nothing else honest I could offer him. "Command's already calling it a decisive victory," Ethan continued, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. "And I understand why. We held the colony. We destroyed most of their invasion fleet. By every measure that matters strategically, it was a win. But it doesn't feel like one, not when I keep thinking about the faces of people who aren't coming home." I understood exactly what he meant, because I had spent the last 3 days wrestling with the same conflicted feelings. The efficiency of humanity's response, the speed and coordination that had allowed us to turn back a full invasion fleet in a matter of days rather than the weeks or months such a conflict might have taken for other species, had come at a real and painful cost. We had not achieved this victory through some effortless display of superior strength. We had achieved it through exhausted soldiers making impossible decisions under fire, through pilots pushing themselves and their ships past reasonable limits, through medics like Olivia Barnes working without rest to save as many lives as possible even as the fighting continued around them. "I think that's the part the rest of the Concord doesn't understand about us," I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it aloud. "They see how fast we moved, how quickly we turned this around, and they call it recklessness or aggression, but it's not that we don't feel the cost. It's that we've learned, through our own history, that hesitating in the face of a real threat only makes the cost worse in the end." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the scarred remains of the market where he and I had once bought food together during my visits before my transfer to the Concord station. "Our history is full of wars that dragged on for years because people waited too long to respond, or responded half-heartedly, trying to manage a conflict instead of ending it. Millions of people died in wars that could have been shortened if someone had been willing to commit fully instead of hesitating." "That's exactly it," I said. "We're not brutal because we enjoy it. We're brutal because we understand, better than almost anyone else in this galaxy, exactly what happens when a war is allowed to drag on. Every hour of hesitation is measured in lives, and we've paid that price too many times throughout our own history to ever be comfortable paying it again." Word of the battle's outcome spread quickly through the Concord in the days that followed, and I began to see a noticeable shift in how other species discussed humanity's involvement in the wider galactic community. The same delegates who had once dismissed our military capabilities as unpolished and disorganized were now studying recordings of the New Harbor engagement with a mixture of caution and genuine unease. I returned briefly to Concord Station Meridian during this period, tasked with delivering a full intelligence report on the battle to the Council. The atmosphere aboard the station had changed noticeably since the night the alarm first tore through my sleep. Where once I had felt like the newest and least respected voice in every room, I now noticed alien delegates watching me with a careful, measured attention they had never shown before. Illith Corvain approached me shortly after I arrived, her 4 eyes studying me with an expression I still found difficult to fully interpret. "I watched the recordings of the battle," she said without preamble. "The coordination your species displayed, adapting tactics in real time against a numerically superior force, it does not match anything in our historical records of first contact scenarios with young species." "We've had a lot of practice adapting quickly," I said carefully, unsure how much of the deeper truth she was ready to hear. "Our history gave us very little choice in the matter." She considered this for a long moment. There is something troubling about a species capable of such devastating efficiency in warfare, even when that efficiency is used defensively. Many among the Council fear what it might mean if humanity were ever provoked into a conflict of greater scale. I thought carefully about how to respond, remembering the weight of grief I had seen in Ethan's eyes, the exhaustion on the faces of every soldier who had fought to defend New Harbor. "I understand that fear," I said finally, "but I think it comes from a misunderstanding of why we fight the way we do. We don't want war. No one who has lived through what my brother and countless others experienced over these past 3 days wants that. We simply refuse to fight a war halfway once it's been forced upon us, because we've learned through painful experience that half measures only prolong suffering rather than preventing it." Illith's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been the beginning of understanding passing across her unfamiliar features. "That is a difficult distinction for some of my colleagues to accept." "It's a difficult distinction for us too," I admitted. "We're not proud of how quickly we can turn to violence when it becomes necessary. We're relieved, every single time, that it doesn't have to last long once we commit to ending it." The formal council session that followed was a tense affair, filled with careful questions from delegates still processing the true scale of what had happened at New Harbor. I presented the intelligence report as objectively as I could, detailing the strategic decisions, the tactical adaptations, and the significant losses suffered on both sides throughout the 3-day engagement. Sorinth, the Velkari elder who had once insisted on lengthy deliberation before authorizing any response to the initial attack, listened to the report with an expression far more subdued than the calm patience he had displayed during the crisis itself. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before addressing the chamber. "It appears," he said slowly, "that our previous assessments of humanity's military readiness were significantly mistaken." A murmur moved through the assembled delegates, and I felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes settling on me, no longer with the polite condescension I had grown accustomed to during my time on the station, but with something closer to genuine caution. "The Skarn Dominion believed the same thing," I said, choosing my words carefully. "They believed our species would be too disorganized, too fractured by internal disagreement, to mount an effective and rapid response to an unprovoked attack. That miscalculation cost them the majority of their regional invasion fleet within 3 days." I paused, letting the weight of that statement settle across the chamber, before continuing. "I want to be clear about something, though. My people take no pride in what happened at New Harbor. We lost soldiers, colonists, friends, family members. The victory came at a real and painful cost, one we will carry with us for a long time. We did not choose this conflict, and given the choice, we would never choose it again." Sorinth studied me for a long moment, his ancient, measured expression giving little away. "Then why fight with such overwhelming intensity, rather than a more measured, proportional response?" I thought of Ethan, sitting alone amid the ruins of the market, grieving for people he had trained and eaten meals with only days earlier. I thought of every story I had ever heard from my grandparents about wars that had dragged on for years longer than necessary, costing far more lives than a swift, decisive response might have prevented. Because we've learned, through our own painful history, that a war fought halfway causes more suffering in the long run than a war ended as quickly and completely as possible, I said. We do not start conflicts, Elder Sorinth, but once one is forced upon us, we understand that mercy sometimes looks like speed, and hesitation sometimes causes more harm than the very violence everyone fears. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking, and I could see, in the careful, thoughtful expressions of the delegates around me, that something fundamental had shifted in how they viewed humanity's place within the wider Concord. We were no longer simply the newest, most unpredictable species at the table. We had become something the rest of the galaxy would need to take seriously, whether they were entirely comfortable with that reality or not. 3 weeks passed before the Skarn Dominion formally approached the Concord with terms of surrender. In that time, humanity's standing within the Council had transformed so completely that I sometimes found it difficult to reconcile the way delegates now treated me with the memory of how things had been only a month earlier. I sat in on the surrender negotiations as part of the human delegation, occupying a seat that had once been positioned at the far edge of the council chamber, reserved for the newest and least influential members of the coalition. Now I found myself seated much closer to the center, close enough to watch the Skarn ambassador's expression as he delivered his people's formal request for peace. The ambassador, an aging Skarn official named Threxa Vol, spoke with none of the confident aggression I imagined his people must have carried into the initial attack on New Harbor. His voice was measured, careful, clearly chosen to avoid provoking any further escalation from a species his government had badly underestimated. The Dominion acknowledges the significant losses inflicted during the recent conflict, Vol said, his translated voice carrying a note of genuine caution. We propose a full withdrawal from contested border regions, along with substantial reparations to affected human colonies, in exchange for a formal cessation of hostilities. Admiral Bennett, seated at the head of the human delegation, studied the terms for a long moment before responding. Your forces struck an undefended colony without warning or provocation. The reparations you're proposing account for infrastructure damage, but they don't account for the lives lost, both civilian and military, as a direct result of that decision. Vol's composure faltered slightly. The Dominion is prepared to discuss additional compensation for the loss of life, though I must be honest, Admiral. Our military analysts did not anticipate the scale or speed of your response. Our original strategic assessment believed a limited strike against a single colony would demonstrate our regional dominance without provoking a response capable of threatening our broader military position. You believed we would hesitate, Bennett said flatly. You believed a young species still finding its place among the stars would spend weeks debating an appropriate response while your forces consolidated their gains. That was our assessment, yes, Vol admitted, and I could see the difficulty he had in stating it plainly. It was, evidently, a significant miscalculation. I watched this exchange unfold with a strange mixture of vindication and lingering sadness. The Skarn Dominion's surrender confirmed everything humanity's rapid, decisive response had been meant to achieve, a swift and complete end to hostilities before they could spiral into a longer, far more costly conflict. And yet I could not forget the cost that decisive response had carried, the soldiers who would not return home, the colonists who had lost everything in those first chaotic hours of the attack. After the formal negotiations concluded, Sorinth approached me quietly near the edge of the chamber, his ancient expression carrying something I had not seen from him before, a genuine curiosity mixed with lingering unease. Lieutenant Cole, he said, I find myself wanting to understand something more fully, if you are willing to indulge an old elder's curiosity. Of course, I said. Throughout this entire conflict, your species demonstrated a willingness to commit fully to violence the moment it became necessary. Without the lengthy deliberation my own people, and many others within this Concord, would typically consider prudent, Sorenth said. And yet, in every conversation I've had with human representatives since the conflict began, I sense no genuine desire for that violence, only a grim acceptance of its necessity. That's an accurate observation, I said. Then help me understand, Sorenth continued. Why does your species fight this way? Why commit so completely, so quickly, to a path most other species would approach with far greater caution? I thought carefully about how to answer, drawing on everything I had witnessed over the past month, from Admiral Bennett refusing to wait for council deliberation, to Ethan grieving for soldiers he had trained beside only days earlier, to the quiet, exhausted determination I had seen in every human face throughout the entire New Harbor engagement. Our history is filled with wars that dragged on far longer than they needed to, I said, conflicts where leaders hesitated, where responses were measured and cautious, in ways that seemed reasonable at the time, but ultimately cost far more lives than a swift, decisive response would have. We learned, through generations of painful experience, that half measures in war often cause more suffering than they prevent. Sorenth listened carefully, his ancient eyes studying me with an intensity that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. We don't start wars, Elder Sorenth, I continued. Every conflict my species has fought since joining this concord has been forced upon us by someone else's decision to attack first. But once that decision has been made by someone else, we understand that dragging the conflict out, responding cautiously and incrementally instead of ending it as quickly and completely as possible, only prolongs the suffering for everyone involved, including the people who started it. A difficult philosophy for many species to embrace, Sorenth said quietly. It's not something we embrace easily either, I admitted. Every soldier who fought at New Harbor will carry the weight of that battle for the rest of their lives. We don't take pride in how quickly we can turn to violence when it's forced upon us. We're simply grateful, every time, that our willingness to commit fully means it doesn't have to last longer than necessary. Sorenth was quiet for a long moment, considering my words with the same careful, measured patience that had once frustrated me so deeply during the initial crisis at New Harbor. Now, understanding the wisdom behind centuries of careful deliberation that had guided his species through countless historical conflicts, I found myself appreciating that patience rather than resenting it. I believe, he said finally, that the Concord will need to reconsider many of its previous assumptions about your species going forward. I think that's probably true, I agreed. In the months that followed the Skarn Dominion's surrender, humanity's role within the Concord shifted dramatically. Delegations that had once dismissed our fleet numbers and military doctrine as unpolished and disorganized now sought our input on defensive strategy discussions. Species that had previously viewed our elections and public disagreements as chaotic weaknesses began to recognize them instead as the visible surface of a deeper strength, a species capable of channeling disagreement and diversity of thought into unified, decisive action the moment a genuine threat emerged. I returned to New Harbor several times during this period, watching the colony slowly rebuild from the devastation of that first terrible night. Ethan remained stationed there, continuing his service alongside the same soldiers who had fought beside him during those desperate 3 days, though I noticed a quieter, more thoughtful version of my brother had emerged from that experience, someone who carried the weight of what he had witnessed with a maturity that had not been there before. We stood together one evening near the rebuilt market, watching the sun set over a colony that had learned, in the most painful way possible, exactly what it meant to be defended by a species willing to commit fully to protecting its own. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd hesitated?" Ethan asked quietly, watching the last light fade over the horizon. "If Admiral Bennett had waited for the council to finish its deliberation before authorizing a response?" "I try not to think about it," I said honestly, "but I know it wouldn't have ended well for the people trapped in those shelters." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding passing between us, without needing further words. "I used to think our reputation in the Concord was something we needed to overcome, This idea that we're reckless or unpredictable compared to species who plan and deliberate more carefully. Now I think maybe it's something we should embrace, as long as we never forget the cost that comes with it. I thought about Sorenth's careful, measured questions during our conversation in the council chamber, about Eilith Corvain's cautious curiosity as she studied recordings of the battle, about the quiet respect I now saw in the eyes of delegates who had once barely acknowledged my presence at the council table. Humanity had not asked to be tested in this way. We had not chosen the war that the Skarn Dominion forced upon us, and given the choice, every soldier who fought at New Harbor would have preferred a galaxy where that conflict never needed to happen at all. But faced with a threat that could not be avoided, we had responded not with hesitation or careful deliberation, but with the same decisive, unified purpose that had carried our species through every difficult chapter of our own turbulent history. We had turned individual disagreement into collective strength, transformed grief and fear into swift, coordinated action, and ended a conflict in days that might have dragged on for months or years under a more cautious approach. The rest of the galaxy was only beginning to understand what that meant. As the final light faded over New Harbor, and Ethan and I stood together in comfortable silence amid the sounds of a colony slowly healing from its wounds, I found myself thinking about the words I had spoken to Sorenth in that council chamber, words that I believed would come to define humanity's place within the wider galactic community for generations to come. We do not start wars, but when a war finds us, whether we seek it or not, we finish it completely, decisively, and without the hesitation that so many other species mistake for wisdom. The Skarn Dominion had learned that lesson at a devastating cost. I suspected, watching the stars begin to appear over the rebuilt colony, that it would be a very long time before any other species in the galaxy made the same mistake of underestimating exactly what humanity was capable of when someone we loved was threatened. We had never wanted this reputation, but we had earned it, one impossible night at a time, and we would carry the weight of that reputation, along with the memory of everyone we had lost earning it, for as long as the stars themselves continued to burn above us.